The knife was already at her throat when Elena Whitfield realized her father had sold her like cattle. She did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only made men laugh. Instead, she stood perfectly still in the cold stone hall of Ashgrove Castle, watching the guard who held the blade, watching the trembling of her own father as he counted the gold coins spilling from a velvet pouch. "This settles the debt," said the man in the dark coat, the one who had escorted her here without a single word of comfort. "The girl is now property of the crown." Elena's father did not look at her. He never looked at her, not since her mother died 3 winters ago, not since the debts began to pile like snow against a locked door. She wanted to hate him for this. Part of her already did. "Take her to the throne room," the guard said. "The king will decide what to do with her." The king. Alpha Damien Ashgrove. Even his name made servants lower their eyes. Elena had heard the stories whispered in market squares and taverns. Stories of a man who had burned an entire rival pack to the ground after they murdered his family. Stories of a king with no mercy left in his chest. Only ash, where a heart used to be. She walked through the corridors with her chin lifted, refusing to let the guards see her fear. The castle was larger than anything she had ever imagined, its walls lined with old portraits of Ashgrove ancestors, their painted eyes following her like judges at a trial she had not agreed to attend. When the great doors of the throne room opened, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. He was sitting at the far end of the hall, one arm resting along the throne, his eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes. Elena had expected age in his face, cruelty carved into every line. What she found instead unsettled her more. He was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of stillness that came from a man who had learned to hide everything he felt. "Your Majesty," the guard said, bowing low. "The girl from the Whitfield estate. Payment for the debt, as agreed." Damien did not rise from his throne. His gaze moved over her once, slow and unreadable, the way a man might study a stranger's face and try to remember where he had seen it before. "Leave us," he said. The guards hesitated. No one hesitated when the king gave an order, but this order was different, and even they seemed to sense it. They bowed and filed out, the great doors closing behind them with a heavy, final sound. Elena was alone with him now, alone with the man the whole kingdom feared. She braced herself. She had heard what happened to women who came to this castle as payment for debts. She had heard the whispers about the last king before him, about chains and cages and worse. She would not cry. She would not beg. If this was the end of her freedom, she would meet it standing. Damien rose from his throne and walked toward her, each step unhurried, each step making her heart beat faster. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, close enough to see that his eyes, for all their coldness, were also tired, the eyes of a man who had not slept peacefully in a very long time. "What is your name?" he asked. The question surprised her. She had expected an order, not a question. "Elena," she said. "Elena Whitfield." He nodded once, as though filing the name away somewhere important. Then he did something she did not expect at all. He turned from her and walked to a small table near the window, where a jug of water and 2 cups sat untouched. He poured one and held it toward her. "You must be thirsty," he said. "The road from the Whitfield estate is long." Elena stared at the cup, as though it might be poisoned. "I was told I belonged to you now." Something flickered across his face, something that might have been anger, though it did not seem aimed at her. "You belong to no one," he said. "Whatever agreement your father made with my treasury, it ends the moment you walk through those doors. Take the water, you have had a difficult day." She did not move. Trust was a luxury she could not afford, not from a man whose name alone made grown warriors flinch. "I am not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "You have my word, and I do not give it lightly." Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and took the cup. The water was cool and clean, and she drank it faster than she intended, her thirst outrunning her caution. Damien watched her with an expression she could not name, something between curiosity and quiet sorrow. "Summon the housekeeper," he called out, and a servant who must have been waiting just beyond the doors entered at once. "Prepare the east chamber for Miss Whitfield, the one with the garden view. See that she has everything she needs, and assign 2 guards to her door, not to keep her in, but to keep others out." The housekeeper, an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a tight bun, glanced at Elena with open surprise before bowing to the king. "Yes, your majesty, at once." Elena could not hide her confusion. "I don't understand." "I was told I would serve you, that I would be your property." Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment the coldness returned to his eyes, though again it did not seem to be directed at her. "There has been a misunderstanding, one I intend to correct. You are a guest in this castle, not a prisoner, not property, not anything less than a person with her own will. My first order to you is simple. You will move freely within these walls. You will speak your mind, and you will never again refer to yourself as something that was sold." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had steeled herself for cruelty, for chains, for a life she could not escape. She had not prepared herself for kindness, and kindness, strangely, was far more difficult to withstand. "Why?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Why would the ruthless Alpha King show mercy to a girl his own treasury purchased? Something dark passed behind his eyes, quick as a shadow crossing the sun. "Because I know what it feels like to be treated as something other than human," he said, his voice low. "And I will not be the reason someone else learns that same lesson." Before she could ask what he meant, he turned and walked back toward his throne, leaving her standing in the middle of the vast hall with more questions than she had arrived with. The housekeeper gently touched her arm and guided her toward the doors, whispering that the king rarely explained himself and that she should not expect more than what he had already given. That night, Elena sat in the east chamber, a room grander than anything she had known in her father's crumbling house. A fire crackled in the hearth. The bed was soft, the blankets warm, and through the window she could see a garden bathed in moonlight, roses climbing along stone walls that had likely stood for centuries. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt more unsettled than ever. Every story she had heard about Damien Ashgrove painted him as a monster, a king who ruled through fear and left nothing but ruin in his wake. Yet the man she had met today spoke softly, poured her water with his own hands, and ordered guards to protect her rather than confine her. There had to be a reason. Men like him did not change their nature for a stranger. Perhaps this kindness was simply the beginning of a longer game, a way to lower her guard before revealing his true intentions. She had learned not to trust gentleness that arrived without explanation, not after watching her father's gentle promises turn to broken debts and desperate bargains. A soft knock came at her door. She rose cautiously and opened it to find not a guard, but a young woman close to her own age, dressed in the deep blue uniform of a castle servant, her arms full of fresh linens. "My name is Bridget," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'll be helping you settle in. The king asked that I look after you personally." Elena studied her for a long moment. Does the king often ask servants to look after his guests personally? Bridget's smile faltered slightly, as though she were choosing her next words with care. "Never, miss. Not once in the 3 years I've served here. You should know that whatever brought you to this castle, something about you has already changed things. The staff are talking. Nobody quite knows what to make of it." Elena's stomach tightened with a mixture of dread and something else, something she refused to name. She thought of the king's tired eyes, the scar along his jaw, the way his voice had roughened when he spoke of knowing what it felt like to be treated as something less than human. Whatever secrets Damien Ashgrove carried, whatever grief hid behind his crown, Elena had the growing sense that her arrival at this castle was only the beginning of something far larger than a debt paid in gold. As Bridget helped her prepare for sleep, laying out a nightgown softer than anything she had ever owned, Elena found herself staring out at the moonlit garden, wondering what kind of man could be both feared by an entire kingdom and gentle enough to hand a frightened stranger a cup of water with his own hands. She did not sleep easily that night. Every creak of the old castle walls made her sit up in the darkness, listening, waiting for some trap to spring. But no trap came, only silence, and the distant sound of wind moving through rose bushes in a garden that, for reasons she could not explain, already felt less like a prison and more like the first uncertain step towards something she had never expected to find within these walls. By morning, sunlight spilled gently across her bed, and for a strange, brief moment, Elena forgot where she was. Then memory returned, sharp and immediate, and she rose to find a simple but elegant dress laid across a chair, along with a note in careful handwriting. "Breakfast is served in the garden courtyard whenever you are ready. There is no obligation to attend. Damien. She read the note twice, searching for hidden meaning, for the command disguised as courtesy. She found none. Only an offer, freely given, and somehow that unsettled her more than any order could have. Elena dressed slowly, her mind circling the same unanswered question from the night before. Why would a king known for ruthlessness extend such gentle treatment to a girl he did not know? A girl whose only connection to him was a debt paid by a father who barely looked at her. She had no answer, only a growing certainty that whatever waited for her in that garden courtyard would begin to reveal it. She stepped into the hallway, where two guards stood exactly as promised, not blocking her path but simply present, watching over her rather than watching her. One of them offered a small, respectful nod as she passed, an acknowledgement she had not expected from armed men in a castle known for its severity. As she made her way toward the garden, following the directions Bridget had given her earlier, Elena could not shake the feeling that she was walking into the opening scene of a story far larger than herself, one where the ruthless Alpha King's first order had already begun to unravel everything she thought she understood, about fear, about power, and about the fragile, dangerous possibility of trust. The garden courtyard was nothing like Elena expected from a castle so often described in whispers of fear. Sunlight fell through the leaves of old oak trees, scattering gold across a stone table set with fresh bread, fruit, and warm tea. Damien sat at the far end, a folded parchment in his hand, his expression calm in a way that seemed almost foreign, compared to the cold authority he had shown the day before. He looked up when she approached, and something in his posture eased, though only slightly. "You came," he said. "I half expected you wouldn't." "Your note said there was no obligation," Elena replied, taking the seat across from him with careful caution. "I wanted to see if that was true. And is it? I suppose I'll find out by the end of breakfast." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He gestured to the food. "Eat. You barely touched anything yesterday." She hesitated only a moment before reaching for a piece of bread, still warm from the oven. The simple act of eating in his presence felt strange, almost intimate, though she reminded herself sharply that this man was still a stranger, still the ruler whose reputation preceded him into every room. "May I ask you something?" she said finally. "You may ask." "I cannot promise an answer. Why did you give that order yesterday? Why treat me as a guest, instead of what the treasury records must say I am?" Damien set down the parchment he had been holding, folding his hands together as he considered his words. "Because I have seen what happens when people are treated as objects instead of individuals. I watched it destroy someone I loved. I will not be the reason it happens to anyone else, especially not within these walls." "Someone you loved," Elena repeated softly, unable to hide her curiosity. "Who?" For a moment, she thought he would refuse to answer, that the door she had glimpsed the night before would close entirely. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the garden wall, toward roses climbing in tangled, thorny beauty. "My sister," he said. "Before I became king, our family was betrayed by an alliance we trusted. She was taken as leverage, treated as nothing more than a bargaining piece. By the time we found her, it was too late to save her. I have spent every year since making certain no one under my protection is ever treated the way she was." Elena's chest tightened with an ache she had not expected to feel toward a man she barely knew. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't know. Few do. I don't speak of it often." He met her eyes again, and the storm clouds within them seemed, for a moment, to clear. "But I wanted you to understand why yesterday's order mattered to me. You are not a possession, Elena Whitfield. Not while you remain in this castle, and not after, should you ever choose to leave." The words settled over her like warmth after a long, cold winter. She studied him carefully, searching for the trap she still half expected to find, the catch hidden beneath kindness. She found none, only a man carrying grief heavier than any crown. "The kingdom fears you," she said, testing the boundaries of this strange new honesty between them. "They say you destroyed an entire pack without mercy." His jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "I did," he said simply. "The same pack responsible for my sister's death. I do not regret protecting my people from those who would harm them again. But cruelty for its own sake has never interested me, whatever the stories claim. There is a difference between justice and ruthlessness. even if the world outside these walls prefers a simpler tale. Elena considered this, turning the words over carefully. She had arrived expecting a monster, and found instead a man shaped by loss, ruling through strength because gentleness alone had once failed to protect the people he loved most. It did not erase her caution entirely, but it softened the edges of her fear, replacing it with something far more complicated. Their conversation drifted into quieter topics as breakfast continued: the weather, the history of the garden, the roses that had been planted by his grandmother decades before. Elena found herself relaxing in small increments, laughing once at a dry observation he made about the castle's overly formal advisors, surprised by how easily laughter came despite everything. But peace within castle walls rarely lasted long. A guard approached briskly, bowing low before speaking. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption. Lord Harwick has arrived, and requests an urgent audience." Damien's expression shifted instantly, the warmth of moments before folding away behind a mask of composed authority. "Lord Harwick does not arrive unannounced without reason," he murmured, more to himself than to Elena. He rose from the table. "Forgive me. Duties of the crown rarely wait for breakfast to finish." "Of course," Elena said, though disappointment flickered through her unexpectedly. He paused before leaving, turning back toward her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Enjoy the garden, if you wish. Bridget will show you the library later, should you prefer books to roses. My home is yours to explore, Elena." That was not an empty offer. She watched him disappear through the archway, his broad shoulders squared with the weight of responsibilities she could only imagine. Alone again, she sat with her tea slowly cooling, replaying his words, his story, the grief hidden behind eyes that had briefly, unexpectedly, opened themselves to her. Later that morning, curiosity pulled her toward the library, rather than the garden. Bridget led her through winding corridors, lined with tapestries, depicting battles and treaties long past, until they reached a grand room filled floor to ceiling with books, the scent of old parchment thick in the air. "The king spends more time here than anywhere else in the castle," Bridget said, dusting a shelf absently, "especially at night, when sleep doesn't come easily." "Does it not come easily often?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Bridget's expression grew somber. "Not since his sister passed. The staff have learned not to ask questions, but we all noticed the candle burning late in this room, night after night." Elena wandered between the shelves, trailing her fingers along worn spines, imagining the king alone, in this vast quiet room, carrying grief too heavy to set down, even in sleep. She thought of the coldness the kingdom whispered about, the fear his name inspired in taverns and marketplaces, and wondered how much of that fear was built upon a story the world had chosen to believe, rather than the truth she was beginning to glimpse. As the day stretched into afternoon, Elena found herself increasingly aware of how different this castle felt from what she had imagined during the long journey from her father's estate. She had prepared herself for chains and cruelty, for a life stripped of dignity. Instead, she had found guards who protected rather than confined her, a housekeeper who treated her with genuine warmth, and a king whose first order had been to give her freedom rather than take it away. Yet Lord Harwick's unannounced arrival lingered in her thoughts, a small dark cloud on an otherwise unexpectedly gentle horizon. Kings did not receive urgent, unannounced visitors without consequence, and Elena could not shake the feeling that, whatever business had pulled Damien away from breakfast, carried weight far beyond a simple morning interruption. That evening, she caught sight of him crossing a distant hallway, his expression drawn tight with tension she had not seen during their quiet breakfast together. He did not notice her watching, too absorbed in whatever conversation he carried with two stern-faced advisors flanking his sides. For just a moment, before he disappeared around a corner, Elena glimpsed something raw beneath his composed authority, something that looked remarkably like fear. Whatever Lord Harwick had brought to the castle that morning, it was clear the peace Elena had begun to feel within these walls might not last as long as she had hoped. And as she returned to her chamber that night, the same unanswered question circled her thoughts endlessly. What kind of danger could unsettle a king, powerful enough to be feared by an entire realm? 3 days passed before Elena learned the reason behind Lord Harwick's urgent visit, and when she finally did, the knowledge arrived not through Damien himself, but through an overheard conversation she was never meant to hear. She had been walking toward the library late in the evening, drawn again by the quiet comfort of its towering shelves, when raised voices drifted from behind a half-closed door near the council chamber. She recognized Damien's voice immediately, sharper than she had heard it before, edged with barely restrained anger. "The Draven Pack has no right to demand anything from this kingdom," he said. "Their territory ends at the northern ridge, and it has for 20 years. "They claim otherwise, Your Majesty," came Lord Harwick's reply, older and measured, though laced with concern. "And they claim the girl currently residing in your castle changes the terms of an old agreement." Elena froze in the shadowed hallway, her heart suddenly pounding. "Elena has nothing to do with the Draven Pack," Damien said, his voice dropping lower, dangerous in its quiet control. "Doesn't she?" Harwick pressed. "Her father's estate borders their territory. If the Draven Pack decides her presence here violates old boundary agreements, they will use it as justification for conflict, whether the claim holds truth or not. You know how Alpha Draven operates. He does not need real cause, he only needs an excuse." Silence stretched long enough that Elena nearly turned to leave, fearful of being discovered listening. Then Damien spoke again, quieter now, almost to himself. "I will not send her away simply because a power-hungry Alpha wants an excuse for war." "No one is suggesting that," Harwick said gently. "But you must consider the possibility that her safety, and the safety of this kingdom, may soon be tested in ways neither of us can predict." Elena stepped back from the door, her pulse racing, her mind spinning through implications she had not considered. She had believed her arrival at Ashgrove Castle was purely a matter of debt and desperation, a transaction between her father and the crown. She had never imagined her presence here could ripple outward into territorial disputes between rival packs, into the kind of conflict that ended not in words, but in bloodshed. She retreated to her chamber that night without visiting the library, her thoughts too tangled to find comfort among books. Sleep came late and uneasy, filled with half-formed dreams of shadowed borders and distant howls carried on cold wind. The following morning, Damien sought her out himself, finding her in the garden courtyard where she had taken to eating breakfast in quiet solitude. His expression was carefully composed, though Elena had learned enough in these past days to recognize the tension hidden beneath his calm. "You heard something last night," he said without preamble, settling into the seat across from her. "I could see it in your face when we passed in the hallway this morning." There seemed little point in denying it. "I heard Lord Harwick mention the Draven Pack. I heard him say my presence here might cause trouble for your kingdom." Damien's jaw tightened, though his eyes remained steady on hers. "Alpha Draven has wanted an excuse to challenge Ashgrove territory for years. Your arrival gave him one, however weak the justification truly is." "Then perhaps I should leave," Elena said, the words tasting bitter even as she spoke them. "If my presence threatens your kingdom's peace, I have no right to remain here simply for my own comfort." "No." The word came sharp and immediate, surprising them both with its intensity. Damien seemed to catch himself, softening his tone before continuing. "You will not leave because a greedy Alpha wants an excuse for conflict he has sought for years, regardless of your presence. Sending you away would only prove that fear controls this crown, and I refuse to rule that way." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the deeper truth beneath his firm refusal. "Is this about pride then? About refusing to appear weak in front of a rival?" Something flickered in his expression, quick and unguarded. "It is about refusing to let someone else's cruelty dictate the choices made within my own walls. I told you once that you are not a possession here, Elena. That includes not becoming a bargaining piece for whatever excuse Alpha Draven invents next." The sincerity in his voice settled something uneasy within her chest, though the danger Harwick described remained undiminished. She thought of her father's crumbling estate, bordering territory she had never fully understood the significance of, and wondered how many other threads of her old life might unravel into complications she had never anticipated. "Tell me about Alpha Draven," she said finally. "If his ambitions threaten this kingdom, regardless of my presence, I would rather understand the danger than remain ignorant of it." Damien considered her request for a long moment, before nodding slowly. He inherited his territory from a father who built its wealth through fear, rather than loyalty. Draven has spent the years since expanding that same philosophy, testing borders, searching for weakness in every neighboring pack. Ashgrove has resisted his ambitions for over a decade, but resistance alone will not satisfy a man who measures success only through conquest. And you believe he will use me as justification for something he already intended to do? I believe, Damien said carefully, that Alpha Draven has been waiting for any excuse, and unfortunately, your arrival gave him one convenient enough to use. Elena absorbed this information slowly, piecing together the shape of a conflict far larger than herself, one that had existed long before her father's debts brought her to this castle. She thought of the guards stationed outside her door, guards Damien had explained were meant to protect rather than confine her. Perhaps that protection carried more weight than she had initially understood. What happens now? She asked. Now, Damien said, rising from his seat with quiet determination. I ensure Alpha Draven understands that Ashgrove territory remains exactly as strong and unified as it has always been. Whatever excuse he seeks to manufacture, he will find no weakness here to exploit. Over the following days, Elena watched the castle shift subtly around her, guards increasing along the outer walls, advisors moving with quicker steps through stone corridors, messengers arriving and departing at hours that suggested urgent, careful diplomacy unfolding behind closed doors. Damien remained composed throughout, never allowing panic to show in front of his people, though Elena occasionally glimpsed the same tired weight in his eyes she had noticed during their very first meeting. One evening, unable to sleep, she wandered toward the library again, drawn by its quiet comfort despite the growing tension throughout the castle. She found Damien already there, seated near the tall windows, a book open on his lap, though his eyes remained fixed on the darkened garden beyond the glass. You're not sleeping either, she observed, stepping quietly into the room. He glanced up, offering a tired but genuine smile. Sleep has never come easily in this castle, not for many years. She settled into the chair across from him, the same quiet comfort from their earlier breakfast, returning, despite the tension pressing at the edges of the kingdom. Will there be war? She asked directly, tired of dancing around the question weighing heaviest on her mind. Damien closed his book slowly, considering his answer with obvious care. I hope not. Alpha Draven understands that war carries costs even victors struggle to recover from. My hope is that a clear demonstration of Ashgrove's strength will convince him the excuse he seeks is not worth the price he would pay to pursue it. And if it isn't enough? His eyes met hers, steady despite the uncertainty behind them. Then I will do whatever is necessary to protect this kingdom, and everyone within it, including you. The quiet certainty in his voice settled something within her, though fear for the days ahead remained undiminished. She thought of her father's estate, of the debts that had brought her here, of the strange and unexpected turns her life had taken since walking through Ashgrove's grand doors. Whatever danger Alpha Draven represented, Elena found herself unwilling to simply wait passively for its resolution. Teach me, she said suddenly, surprising herself as much as him. Teach me about this kingdom, about its politics, its history, its strengths. If my presence here has become tangled in matters of war, I would rather understand the full picture than remain a helpless bystander to my own circumstances. Damien studied her for a long moment, something like respect passing behind his tired eyes. That, he said quietly, is not a request I expected from you. But it is one I am glad to honor. As the candle burned lower between them, casting long shadows across towering shelves of old parchment and leather-bound history, Elena began to understand that whatever danger loomed beyond the castle walls, she no longer intended to face it as a passive observer. The girl who had arrived expecting chains had found instead a king willing to teach her, protect her, and treat her as an equal, capable of understanding the weight of decisions that would shape both their futures. Outside, beyond the garden walls and the quiet library window, the northern ridge remained silent under a cold and watchful moon, though Elena could not shake the growing certainty that silence, in matters concerning Alpha Draven, rarely lasted long. The council chamber had never welcomed a woman who was not born into nobility, yet 3 weeks after her arrival, Elena found herself seated at the long oak table, surrounded by advisors, who eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet disapproval. Damien had insisted on her presence, overriding the objections of Lord Harwick and 2 other senior counselors, who believed matters of territorial defense belonged solely to those trained in strategy and war. She has spent the last 2 weeks studying the maps of this kingdom more thoroughly than half the men in this room, Damien said firmly. silencing further protest with a single sharp glance around the table. Her perspective is welcome here. Elena kept her expression steady, despite the weight of unfamiliar scrutiny, grateful for the late nights spent poring over old parchment in the library, tracing borders and territories until the geography of Ashgrove Kingdom felt as familiar as her father's crumbling estate once had. Lord Harwick unrolled a large map across the table, weighted down at its corners with polished stones. Alpha Draven has moved additional forces along the northern ridge, he explained grimly. Scouts report increased patrols near the border, though nothing has crossed into Ashgrove territory yet. He's testing our response, said a younger advisor named Corwin, his brow furrowed with tension. Waiting to see whether we escalate or retreat. Either action plays into his hands, Damien said, studying the map with narrowed eyes. Escalation gives him justification for open conflict. Retreat signals weakness he will exploit further. Elena leaned forward, studying the terrain marked across the parchment, her mind working through the problem with the same careful attention she had once applied to managing her father's failing estate. What if neither escalation nor retreat is the answer? She said quietly. The room fell silent, several advisors turning toward her with expressions ranging from surprise to open skepticism. Damien, however, met her eyes with genuine interest. Go on, he said. You said Alpha Draven wants an excuse for conflict he has sought for years, Elena continued, gathering confidence as she spoke. But conflict is costly, even for the side that wins. What if instead of responding to his provocation directly, Ashgrove strengthened alliances with neighboring territories instead? If Draven understood that attacking Ashgrove meant facing not just this kingdom, but a unified front of allied packs, the cost of his ambition would rise beyond what even his pride could justify. Lord Harwick frowned thoughtfully. Ashgrove has maintained careful neutrality with the Eastern Territories for years. Approaching them now might appear as weakness, a sign that we require assistance to defend our own borders. Or, Elena countered, it might appear as wisdom. A king secure enough in his own strength to build alliances, rather than wait passively for conflict to arrive at his doorstep. Damien studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and impressed passing behind his storm-colored eyes. The Eastern Territories have long resented Draven's aggressive expansion, he said slowly, turning the idea over. They may welcome the opportunity to formalize an alliance against a common threat. It is a considerable risk, Harwick cautioned, though his tone had softened from outright dismissal to careful consideration. Approaching them incorrectly could damage relationships that have taken years to stabilize. Then we approach them correctly, Damien said, his decision settling over the room with quiet finality. Elena's suggestion has merit. I want a formal proposal drafted by week's end. The meeting continued for another hour, strategy unfolding across the table in careful, measured detail. But Elena noticed the subtle shift in how the advisors regarded her, skepticism softening into cautious respect, as her suggestions continued to prove thoughtful and well-reasoned. By the time the council dispersed, even Lord Harwick offered her a small, begrudging nod of acknowledgement before departing the chamber. Damien lingered behind after the others left, watching her gather the notes she had taken throughout the meeting. You surprised them, he said, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. I surprised myself, Elena admitted honestly. I never expected to sit in a room like that, let alone have anyone listen to what I had to say. They listened, because your idea was sound, he said simply. I would not have brought you into that chamber otherwise, regardless of how much I might have wanted your company. The admission caught her off guard, warmth spreading through her chest despite her attempts to remain composed. She had noticed, over the past weeks, the way his expression softened slightly whenever she entered a room, the way conversations between them had grown longer and more comfortable, stretching from careful courtesy into something that felt increasingly like genuine friendship, perhaps even something more. Thank you, she said quietly, for trusting my perspective, even when others doubted it. Trust is not something I extend easily, Damien said, his voice growing softer. But you have earned it, in the weeks since your arrival, more thoroughly than most people manage in years. They walked together through the quiet corridors toward the garden courtyard, the late afternoon sun casting long golden light across ancient stone walls. Elena found herself increasingly aware of his presence beside her, the careful distance they had maintained during their earliest days together, slowly narrowing into something warmer, something she was not entirely certain how to name. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they reached the garden, roses blooming fragrant and full around them. "Always. Do you regret it? Bringing me into castle politics, into matters that extend far beyond a simple debt paid to your treasury." Damien stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression serious and thoughtful. "No," he said firmly. "I have spent years surrounded by advisors who tell me what they believe I want to hear, rather than what I need to know. You speak honestly, Elena, without concern for how your words might be received. That honesty has become more valuable to me than I anticipated when you first arrived." The sincerity in his voice settled warmly within her chest, though she pushed back the growing feelings stirring beneath her careful composure. She reminded herself gently that circumstances between them remained complicated, that whatever connection was forming existed within the shadow of debts and danger, of a kingdom balanced precariously between peace and conflict. Yet standing there among the fragrant roses, watching sunlight catch in his storm-colored eyes, Elena found it increasingly difficult to remember the fear that had gripped her during that first walk through Ashgrove's grand doors. The ruthless Alpha King the kingdom whispered about seemed impossibly distant from the man standing before her now, patient and thoughtful, treating her not as property purchased through desperate bargaining, but as someone whose voice mattered, whose presence had begun to matter more than either of them had likely intended. As evening settled softly over the castle, Elena returned to her chamber with her thoughts full of maps and alliances, of Alpha Draven's looming threat, and the strange, unexpected trust growing between herself and a king the world believed incapable of gentleness. Whatever danger still waited beyond the northern ridge, she found herself grateful, in ways she had not anticipated, for the strange twist of fate that had brought her within these castle walls. The anniversary arrived quietly, without announcement, though Elena noticed the shift in the castle's atmosphere the moment she woke. Servants moved through the halls with careful, muted steps. Bridget's usual cheerful chatter had faded into somber silence as she helped Elena dress that morning, and when Elena asked what troubled everyone, Bridget only shook her head gently. "It is not my place to say, miss. If the king wishes you to know, he will tell you himself." Elena spent the morning uneasy, sensing something significant weighing over the castle, without understanding its shape. She did not see Damien at breakfast, nor in the garden courtyard, where they had grown accustomed to sharing quiet conversation each morning. When she inquired, a guard informed her, with obvious reluctance, that the king had requested solitude for the day. Curiosity and concern warred within her throughout the afternoon. She busied herself in the library, though the words on the pages blurred together, her mind circling back repeatedly to Damien's absence, to the unusual heaviness pressing through the castle's usually composed atmosphere. She made her way toward the private wing of the castle, an area she had never before ventured into, guided by some instinct she did not fully understand. She found him in a small chapel tucked away near the castle's eastern tower, a place she had not known existed until that moment. He knelt before a modest stone memorial, two names carved carefully into its surface, fresh flowers laid at its base. Elena hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether her presence would intrude upon something deeply private. But before she could retreat, Damien spoke without turning. "You may come in, Elena. I suspect you have been searching for me most of the day." She stepped inside quietly, settling beside him, though maintaining a respectful distance. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. "The castle has felt strange today. I wanted to understand why." Damien's gaze remained fixed on the carved names before him. "Today marks the anniversary of my parents' passing," he said, his voice low and heavy with old grief. "The same conflict that took my sister, took them as well, though their deaths came first, during the initial betrayal that shattered our alliance with the Draven Pack's predecessors." Elena's breath caught. "I didn't know your parents died the same way." "Few do," he admitted. "The kingdom remembers my sister's death because it happened publicly, because it fueled the war that followed. My parents died quietly, in the opening moments of betrayal, before anyone understood what was unfolding. I was 17 when I inherited a crown I was not prepared to wear, in the middle of a conflict I did not yet understand how to survive." She absorbed this information slowly, piecing together the full weight of loss shaping the man beside her. She had known fragments of his grief, had glimpsed shadows of it during their conversations, but the complete picture, The crushing totality of losing his entire family within a single devastating season struck her with unexpected force. "How did you survive it?" she asked quietly. "Becoming king so young, carrying grief that heavy, while an entire kingdom depended on your strength?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing absently along the edge of the stone memorial. "I am not certain I did survive it. Not entirely," he admitted, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. "I built walls around whatever remained soft within me, because softness felt like weakness I could not afford. I told myself that ruling through strength, through distance, was the only way to protect what remained of my family's legacy." "And now?" she asked gently. He finally turned to look at her, storm-colored eyes meeting hers with a rawness she had not seen before, vulnerability stripped bare of the careful composure he maintained before his court and advisors. "Now," he said quietly, "I find myself uncertain whether those walls have protected me, or simply left me alone, within a castle full of people who fear, rather than know me." Elena reached out instinctively, her hand covering his where it rested against the cold stone. She did not offer empty words of comfort, sensing instinctively that platitudes would ring hollow against grief this profound. Instead, she simply remained beside him, her presence a quiet anchor against the weight of memory pressing down around them both. "You are not alone tonight," she said softly. "Whatever walls you have built, I am here regardless." Something shifted in his expression, the careful control he maintained cracking just slightly at the edges. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you choose to sit beside a man the entire kingdom fears, on the anniversary of losses that shaped him into someone even he struggles to recognize some days?" "Because," Elena said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate honesty, "I have come to know a version of you the kingdom has never seen. A man who gave a frightened stranger water with his own hands. A man who listened to my ideas in a council chamber when everyone else dismissed me. A man carrying more grief than anyone should have to bear alone, yet still finding room for kindness despite it." Damien's hand turned beneath hers, fingers threading gently between her own, the small gesture carrying weight far beyond its simplicity. "I did not expect," he said quietly, "that bringing you into this castle would change anything beyond settling a debt owed by your father. I certainly did not expect to find myself grateful for your presence in ways I struggle to fully understand." They remained together in the quiet chapel as evening deepened into night, candlelight flickering softly against stone walls, casting gentle shadows across the carved names of the family Damien had lost too young. Elena found herself increasingly aware of the warmth of his hand around hers, of the fragile trust growing steadily between them despite circumstances neither had chosen nor anticipated. "Thank you," Damien said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over them, "for finding me tonight. I have spent every anniversary alone since my sister's death, believing solitude was easier than allowing anyone close enough to witness this particular grief." "You do not have to be alone anymore," Elena said softly. "Not unless that is truly what you want." He studied her carefully in the flickering candlelight, something tender and uncertain passing behind his tired eyes. "I am beginning to think," he said quietly, "that solitude was never truly what I wanted, only what I believed I deserved." The admission hung softly between them, carrying implications neither seemed ready to fully address, though Elena felt the shift regardless, subtle and undeniable, the careful walls between them continuing to soften into something warmer, something neither debts nor danger, nor the shadow of Alpha Draven's ambition could easily unravel. As they finally rose to leave the small chapel together, Damien's hand remaining gently around hers, Elena understood with growing certainty that whatever had begun between them during that first uncertain meeting in the throne room had grown into something far more significant than either of them had anticipated. Whatever challenges still waited beyond the castle walls, she found herself increasingly unwilling to face them from anywhere other than beside him. The illness struck without warning, sudden and violent, twisting through Elena's stomach like fire, just hours after she had shared a quiet dinner with Damien in the small dining hall overlooking the eastern gardens. She woke in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, her body trembling uncontrollably, unable to call out before collapsing against the cold stone floor of her chamber. It was Bridget who found her at dawn, and within moments, the entire castle erupted into controlled chaos. Damien arrived at her chamber before the castle physician, his expression stripped of all composure, raw fear replacing the careful authority he wore before his court. "What happened?" he demanded, kneeling beside her bed where servants had carefully placed her, his hand hovering anxiously near hers, uncertain whether touching her might cause further harm. "We don't know yet, Your Majesty," the physician said grimly, examining her with practiced urgency. "Her symptoms suggest poison, though we have not yet identified the source." Elena drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the following hours, fragments of conversation reaching her through a haze of fever and pain. She heard Damien's voice, low and dangerous, demanding answers from the kitchen staff. She heard Bridget crying softly somewhere nearby. She heard the physician discussing possible remedies, his tone carrying an urgency that frightened her more than the illness itself. By late afternoon, the physician had identified traces of a rare poison mixed into the tea she had consumed the previous evening. A poison slow enough to avoid immediate detection, but potent enough to cause severe harm if left untreated. With careful administration of antidotes and constant attention, her condition began to stabilize, though weakness left her confined to bed for days afterward. Damien barely left her side throughout her recovery, canceling council meetings and delegating diplomatic matters to Lord Harwick, despite the ongoing tension with Alpha Draven's forces along the northern ridge. Elena woke on the third day to find him seated beside her bed, exhaustion etched deeply into his features, his hand still wrapped protectively around hers. "You should be resting," she murmured weakly, her voice hoarse from days of illness. "I have rested enough," he said, though the shadows beneath his eyes suggested otherwise. "I nearly lost you, Elena. Rest was not something I could manage while uncertain whether you would recover." The rawness in his voice settled warmly within her chest, despite her weakened state. "Have you discovered who was responsible?" she asked. His jaw tightened, anger replacing exhaustion in his expression. "One of the kitchen staff, recently hired, has disappeared without explanation. We believe the poison was deliberately placed in your tea, though the servants' motives, or whoever directed them, remain unclear." "You believe this connects to Alpha Draven," Elena said, understanding settling coldly through her, despite her weakened state. "It would not be the first time he has used indirect methods to weaken rivals, rather than risk open conflict," Damien said grimly. "If he cannot manufacture sufficient excuse for war through territorial disputes, perhaps he believed removing you would destabilize the alliance building between Ashgrove and the Eastern Territories." Elena absorbed this information slowly, fear and anger mixing uneasily within her chest. She had understood, in abstract terms, that her presence within Ashgrove Castle carried political weight beyond her own personal circumstances. She had not fully anticipated becoming a direct target for violence, a piece to be removed from a larger, dangerous game of power and ambition. "I am sorry," Damien said quietly, guilt heavy in his voice. "I promised you safety within these walls, and I failed to protect that promise adequately." "This is not your fault," Elena said firmly, squeezing his hand, despite her lingering weakness. "You could not have anticipated this, any more than I could have." "I should have anticipated it," he insisted, frustration bleeding through his careful composure. "I know exactly the kind of man Alpha Draven is. I should have increased protection around you the moment tensions began escalating along the northern ridge." Elena studied him carefully, recognizing beneath his anger and guilt something deeper, something that revealed far more than careful diplomatic concern for a political asset. The fear she had witnessed in his expression when she first regained consciousness, the exhaustion from days spent barely leaving her bedside, the raw vulnerability in his voice now, all pointed toward feelings far more personal than mere strategic concern. "Damien," she said softly, using his given name without title for the first time since her arrival. "This fear, this guilt, it extends beyond simple politics, doesn't it?" He met her eyes, something unguarded and honest passing across his tired features. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "It extends far beyond politics, Elena. I do not know precisely when it happened, but somewhere between that first meeting in the throne room and now, you became someone whose safety matters to me, in ways I have not felt toward anyone since losing my family." The admission settled warmly through her despite her weakened state, though the reality of the danger surrounding them tempered the warmth with lingering fear. "What happens now?" she asked. "If Alpha Draven is willing to use poison rather than open conflict, How do we protect against threats we cannot see coming? Increase security throughout the castle, beginning immediately, Damien said, determination replacing exhaustion in his voice. Additional guards assigned specifically to your protection. Careful investigation into every member of staff, ensuring no further threats have infiltrated these walls. And the Eastern Alliance? Elena asked, thinking of the strategy she had helped develop weeks earlier in the council chamber. Continues, regardless of this attack, Damien said firmly. If anything, this attempt only confirms that Alpha Draven fears the Alliance's potential strength. Retreating now would only prove that fear justified. Elena nodded slowly, strength returning gradually despite the exhaustion still weighing heavily through her body. As the days passed and her recovery continued, Damien remained close, their conversations deepening beyond careful diplomatic strategy into something more personal, more honest. The walls between them continuing to soften, despite the danger pressing steadily closer around Ashgrove Castle's protective walls. By the time she was finally strong enough to walk unassisted through the garden courtyard again, roses blooming fragrant and defiant against the tension gripping the kingdom, Elena understood with unwavering certainty that whatever danger Alpha Draven represented, she was no longer willing to remain a passive target waiting helplessly for the next attack. Whatever role she needed to play in protecting the fragile peace between Ashgrove and its neighboring territories, she intended to face it directly, standing firmly beside the king whose careful walls had finally, completely, opened themselves to her. Recovery brought clarity, and clarity brought Elena to a decision she had been quietly considering since regaining her strength. She requested a private audience with Damien, one conducted not in the formal council chamber, but in the quiet privacy of the library where their friendship had first deepened into something more meaningful. "I want to write to my father," she said, once they had settled into the familiar chairs near the tall windows. "There are questions about the original agreement between your treasury and his estate that I need answered. Questions that have troubled me since the poisoning." Damien's expression grew curious. "What kind of questions?" "The debt," Elena said carefully. "I have never fully understood its origins. My father's estate was struggling, certainly, but the amount owed to your treasury seemed disproportionate to typical debts between neighboring territories. I want to understand exactly how that debt accumulated, and why settling it required, specifically, my presence here, rather than simple payment through land or resources." Something shifted in Damien's expression, a flicker of discomfort quickly masked by careful composure. "Elena, some matters are better left in the past." "Are they?" she pressed gently. "Because the more I consider it, the more I suspect there is more to this arrangement than a simple transaction, born from desperate debt." He was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched him carefully, recognizing the careful deliberation behind his storm-colored eyes, the same expression he wore when weighing difficult truths in council meetings. Finally he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of reluctant surrender. "You deserve the truth," he said quietly. "Your father's debt to my treasury was real, though smaller than what was eventually demanded of him. 6 months before your arrival, Alpha Draven approached your father directly, offering to settle his debts entirely, in exchange for a very different arrangement." Elena's breath caught. "What kind of arrangement?" "Marriage," Damien said grimly. "To Draven himself. Your father, desperate and struggling, seriously considered the offer, unaware of Draven's reputation for cruelty toward those he considers possessions rather than partners." Cold dread settled through Elena's chest as she absorbed this revelation. "How did you learn of this?" "My spies within Draven's territory reported the arrangement before it could be finalized," Damien explained. "I could not allow it to proceed. Draven's previous wife died, under circumstances that were never adequately explained, and I refused to let another innocent woman fall into his control without intervention." "So you intervened," Elena said slowly, pieces beginning to fit together within her mind. "You approached my father yourself. I offered to purchase the debt directly, matching whatever amount Draven had promised, with the explicit condition that you would come to Ashgrove Castle instead," Damien confirmed. "I told your father the arrangement would settle his debts entirely, which was true. I did not initially explain that my intention was your safety, rather than any claim over you as property." Elena sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what he was revealing. The transaction she had believed to be a simple, humiliating sale had actually been an act of protection, carefully orchestrated to remove her from danger she had never even known existed. "You saved me," she said softly, "before we had even met." "I could not allow Draven's cruelty to claim another innocent life," Damien said simply, though something more personal flickered beneath his careful explanation. "When my spies described the arrangement being considered, something within me refused to accept it, even before understanding fully why your safety mattered so intensely." "Why did you never tell me this before?" Elena asked, though she understood, even as she spoke, the likely answer. "Because explaining my intervention meant admitting feelings I did not yet understand myself," Damien said honestly. "I told myself the purchase was purely strategic, preventing Draven from gaining leverage through marriage to your family's territory. It took weeks of your presence within these walls before I recognized that my motivations extended far beyond simple strategy." Elena studied him carefully, warmth and gratitude mixing with lingering shock at the revelation. "So, my father never truly sold me," she said slowly. "He believed he was settling a debt through straightforward payment, unaware that you had specifically intervened to prevent a far more dangerous arrangement." "Yes," Damien confirmed. "Whatever resentment you have carried toward your father's choices, know that his decision, however painful it felt to you, inadvertently protected you from a fate considerably worse than anything experienced within these castle walls." The revelation settled slowly through Elena's understanding, reshaping months of assumptions she had carried since first walking through Ashgrove's grand doors. She had believed herself sold like property, discarded by a father too consumed by debt to consider her well-being. Instead, she discovered a far more complicated truth, one involving danger she had never suspected, and a king whose careful intervention had protected her before either of them understood the deeper connection growing steadily between them. "Thank you," she said softly, emotion thick in her voice, "for protecting me, even before you fully understood why it mattered so deeply." Damien reached across the small distance between their chairs, his hand finding hers with familiar warmth. "I would make the same choice again, without hesitation," he said quietly. "Whatever began as strategic intervention has become something far more significant, Elena. I do not regret a single moment of the path that brought you into this castle, into my life, however complicated its origins may have been." They remained together, in comfortable silence, as evening settled softly through the library windows, the weight of newly understood truth settling gently between them, rather than driving them apart. Elena found herself grateful, in ways she had not anticipated when first arriving, frightened and resentful within these walls, for the complicated, protective intervention that had ultimately led her toward a connection she had never expected to find, let alone treasure as deeply as she now recognized she did. Yet even as warmth and gratitude filled the quiet library, Elena could not fully shake the awareness that Alpha Draven remained a persistent, dangerous threat, one whose ambitions toward her family's territory, and increasingly toward Ashgrove itself, showed no signs of diminishing, despite the failed poisoning attempt weeks earlier. Whatever peace she had found within these walls, she understood clearly now that protecting it would require more than gratitude alone. The Eastern Alliance was formally signed on a bright autumn morning, 3 neighboring territories joining Ashgrove Kingdom in a unified pact against Alpha Draven's escalating ambitions. Elena stood beside Damien throughout the ceremony, watching with quiet pride as leaders who had once maintained careful distance from Ashgrove now clasped hands in genuine partnership, the strategy she had proposed months earlier, finally reaching its fruition. "You should be proud," Damien murmured to her, as the ceremony concluded, the assembled leaders moving toward a celebratory feast prepared in the Great Hall. "This alliance exists because of your insight, Elena. Few advisors would have considered such an approach." "We built it together," Elena replied, though warmth spread through her at his acknowledgement. "Your willingness to trust an unconventional suggestion made this possible as much as the suggestion itself." Their victory, however, proved short-lived. Barely a week after the alliance's signing, a messenger arrived at Ashgrove Castle, bearing urgent news that shattered the fragile peace they had worked so carefully to construct. Elena had been taken. She had ventured into the village bordering the castle grounds that morning, accompanied by only 2 guards, intending to visit the small market that had become a familiar comfort during her months at Ashgrove. The attack came swiftly, and without warning, a coordinated ambush that overwhelmed her guards, before either could raise adequate alarm. By the time reinforcements arrived, Elena had vanished, along with unmistakable evidence pointing directly toward Alpha Draven's involvement. Damien's fury upon receiving the news was unlike anything the castle staff had witnessed before. Bridget later confided to Elena that the entire household had fallen into terrified silence as the king's controlled composure shattered entirely, his voice carrying through stone corridors as he demanded immediate mobilization of every available guard and tracker within his command. Elena, meanwhile, found herself confined within an unfamiliar fortress, its cold stone walls a stark contrast to the warmth she had grown accustomed to within Ashgrove Castle. Alpha Draven himself visited her cell within hours of her capture, his presence carrying an oppressive weight, entirely different from anything she had experienced with Damien. "You have caused considerable inconvenience," Draven said, studying her with cold calculation. "The alliance you helped construct has complicated matters significantly. Fortunately, your value as leverage remains substantial, regardless of that inconvenience." "Damien will not negotiate with someone who resorts to abduction," Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coiling tightly within her chest. Draven's expression twisted into something unpleasant, though he maintained careful composure. "Ashgrove has always been sentimental, a weakness his father shared before him. He will negotiate precisely because your safety matters to him more than strategic advantage. That sentiment, Miss Whitfield, is exactly the leverage I require." Elena refused to allow her fear to show further, drawing instead on the confidence and knowledge she had cultivated during months spent studying Ashgrove's politics and strategy, alongside Damien and his advisors. "You misunderstand him," she said carefully. "Damien does not simply react to sentiment. He calculates carefully, protects strategically. Whatever leverage you believe my capture provides, know that it exists within a larger strategy you have likely failed to fully anticipate." Draven's confidence flickered, uncertainty briefly crossing his expression, before hardening once again into calculated cruelty. "We shall see," he said coldly, before departing her cell without further explanation. Alone in the darkness, Elena drew on every ounce of strength cultivated during her months within Ashgrove Castle, refusing to allow despair to overwhelm the careful determination she had built alongside Damien's steady guidance. She thought of the alliance recently signed, of the strength Ashgrove now commanded through unified neighboring territories, and allowed herself cautious hope that Draven's calculated ambition had underestimated exactly how thoroughly circumstances had shifted since his initial provocations began. Meanwhile, Damien moved with ruthless efficiency, mobilizing not only his own forces but calling immediately upon the newly formed Eastern Alliance for support. Within 2 days, a combined force considerably larger than anything Draven could have anticipated surrounded his fortress, the unified strength of 4 territories standing firmly against his isolated ambition. Lord Harwick, coordinating alongside Damien throughout the tense standoff, later told Elena that he had never witnessed such controlled fury, directed with such precise strategic purpose. Damien did not act rashly, despite his fear for her safety. Instead, he leveraged every advantage the alliance provided, presenting Draven with an impossible choice between immediate surrender or facing combined forces that would overwhelm his fortress within hours should conflict become necessary. Faced with overwhelming odds he had not anticipated when initiating her capture, Draven's confidence crumbled rapidly. Negotiations concluded within a single tense day, Elena's release secured without further bloodshed, though Damien made unmistakably clear that any future provocation from Draven's territory would meet immediate and decisive consequence from the full strength of the unified alliance. When Elena was finally escorted back through Ashgrove Castle's familiar gates, exhaustion and relief overwhelming her in equal measure, she found Damien waiting at the entrance, his careful composure abandoned entirely the moment their eyes met. He crossed the distance between them in swift strides, pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of the fear and relief consuming him throughout her captivity. "I feared I would lose you," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion he made no attempt to hide before the gathered household staff and advisors. "I have faced war, betrayal, and loss throughout my life, Elena, but nothing has terrified me as thoroughly as the possibility of losing you to Draven's cruelty." "I am here," Elena said softly, her own emotion thick in her voice as she returned his embrace fully, the warmth and safety of his presence settling deeply through her exhausted body. "Your alliance, Your strategy. It worked exactly as we had hoped it might. Draven underestimated precisely how thoroughly circumstances had shifted since his initial provocations began. Damien pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face gently, as he studied her, with an intensity that stole her breath entirely. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. Something I should have said long before circumstances forced this crisis upon us. Elena waited, her heart pounding with anticipation, despite her exhaustion. What began as an obligation to protect you from Draven's cruelty has become something far more profound, Damien continued, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability evident in his storm-colored eyes. I love you, Elena. Not as an obligation, not as strategic advantage, but as the woman who has fundamentally changed how I understand strength, trust, and the possibility of genuine partnership. The words settled through her like warmth after the cold terror of captivity, tears gathering unexpectedly, as she absorbed the sincerity behind his declaration. I love you as well, she said softly, certainty settling firmly through every word. I have for some time now, though circumstances made voicing it feel impossibly complicated, until this very moment. Around them, the gathered household staff and advisors maintained respectful, quiet distance, though Elena caught Bridget's delighted smile among the crowd, and even Lord Harwick's careful expression softened into something approaching genuine warmth. Whatever danger Draven's ambition still represented, Elena understood clearly, standing within Damien's steady embrace, that whatever challenges remained ahead, they would face them now, not as king and reluctant guest, but as true partners, bound by trust, respect, and love neither had anticipated finding within circumstances that began through desperate, complicated necessity. Peace, however, did not settle easily over Ashgrove Kingdom despite Draven's forced retreat. 2 weeks after Elena's rescue, Lord Harwick arrived at the morning council meeting with troubling news that quickly dispelled the cautious relief the castle had begun to embrace. Alpha Draven has withdrawn from open confrontation, Harwick reported grimly, but our scouts report unusual movement within his territory. He appears to be gathering forces from smaller, allied packs who have long resented Ashgrove's growing influence. Damien's expression hardened with familiar tension. He intends to circumvent our alliance by building his own coalition. It would seem so, Harwick confirmed. Though his gathered forces remain considerably smaller than our combined alliance, desperation may drive him toward reckless action, regardless of the odds against him. Elena, seated at her now customary place within council meetings, studied the map spread across the table with careful attention. Desperate men make dangerous choices, she said quietly. If Draven believes his position weakening irreversibly, he may choose one final drastic action, rather than accept gradual decline. What kind of action? Asked Corwin, concern evident in his young features. Elena considered the question carefully, drawing on months of strategic study alongside Damien and his advisors. Something symbolic, she suggested slowly. An attack designed not for strategic advantage, but to demonstrate strength, before his gathered allies abandon him entirely. Something that targets what he perceives as Ashgrove's greatest vulnerability. Damien's eyes met hers, understanding passing silently between them. Me, he said quietly. Or you. An attack aimed at either of us would demonstrate the boldness his allies require to maintain confidence in his leadership. The council fell into tense discussion regarding increased security measures, potential preemptive strategies, and careful coordination with their eastern allies, should Draven's desperation manifest into direct confrontation. Elena listened carefully, contributing thoughtful observations throughout the lengthy discussion, though her mind circled increasingly toward a strategy she hesitated to voice aloud. That evening, alone with Damien, in the quiet privacy of their now shared chamber, she finally spoke the idea that had been forming steadily throughout the tense council meeting. I think we should invite him, she said carefully, Draven, to formal negotiations, mediated by our eastern allies, offering him a path toward peace that preserves his dignity, rather than forcing him toward increasingly desperate action. Damien studied her with surprised consideration. After everything he has done, the poisoning, your abduction? Because of everything he has done, Elena clarified. A desperate man surrounded by allies expecting bold action is far more dangerous than a man offered genuine opportunity to step back from conflict without complete humiliation. If we corner him entirely, he has nothing left to lose. If we offer him a legitimate path toward peace, however reluctantly he might accept it, we remove the desperation driving his most dangerous impulses. Damien considered this carefully, his expression thoughtful despite lingering anger toward Draven's previous actions. It is a considerable risk, he said slowly, trusting that he would honor negotiated terms rather than using the opportunity for further treachery. All risk, and mediated carefully by our combined alliance, with clear consequence established should he violate negotiated terms, Elena countered. But consider the alternative: continued tension, continued danger, the constant threat of desperate action, hanging over this kingdom indefinitely. Genuine peace, however difficult to negotiate, offers far more security than perpetual readiness for conflict that may erupt without warning. Damien was quiet for a long moment, weighing her proposal with the same careful consideration he applied to every significant decision affecting his kingdom. Finally, he nodded slowly. I will bring this proposal before the council tomorrow. If our allies agree, we will extend the invitation. The following weeks passed in careful, tense diplomacy. Draven, faced with dwindling support among his gathered allies and the daunting prospect of confronting Ashgrove's combined strength, ultimately agreed to formal negotiations, though his initial demands remained predictably unreasonable. Damien, guided consistently by Elena's careful counsel, remained firm yet patient throughout the lengthy negotiation process, refusing to concede Ashgrove's core interests while offering genuine pathways toward resolution that preserved Draven's dignity without rewarding his previous treachery. The final agreement, reached after nearly a month of careful negotiation, established clear territorial boundaries, formal recognition of Ashgrove's eastern alliance, and specific consequences should Draven's territory violate the negotiated peace in the future. It was not a perfect resolution, nor one that fully addressed the harm Draven had caused throughout the preceding months, but it offered something Elena and Damien both recognized as more valuable than complete victory: sustainable peace built on mutual accountability, rather than temporary submission born from military defeat. You were right, Damien admitted one evening, as they walked together through the garden courtyard, the autumn roses finally beginning to fade with the approaching winter season. Cornering Draven entirely would have likely driven him toward desperate, unpredictable action. This resolution, however imperfect, offers genuine stability. We built it together, Elena reminded him gently, echoing words he had spoken to her months earlier following the Eastern Alliance's initial signing. Your willingness to trust unconventional strategy, even when addressing an enemy who caused us both considerable harm, made this peace possible. Damien stopped walking, turning to face her fully within the fading autumn garden. Elena, he said quietly, these past months have taught me more about genuine strength than years of ruling through fear and isolation ever managed to teach me. You have shown me that strength and compassion are not opposing forces, but rather complementary qualities that, together, create far more sustainable outcomes than either could achieve alone. Elena felt warmth spreading through her chest at his words, gratitude and love mixing together as she considered the remarkable journey that had brought them from that first fearful meeting in the throne room to this quiet moment within the fading garden. We have taught each other, she said softly. Whatever strength I have found within these walls exists because you trusted me enough to let me discover it. As winter approached, and the immediate danger from Draven's ambition finally settled into cautious, sustainable peace, Elena found herself reflecting on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone since that first desperate journey toward Ashgrove Castle. The girl who had arrived expecting chains and cruelty had found instead partnership, respect, and a love she had never anticipated discovering within circumstances that began through such painful necessity. Yet even as peace settled steadily over the kingdom, Elena understood that one significant conversation still remained unresolved, one that would determine the shape of whatever future she and Damien intended to build together, beyond the careful partnership they had already established. Winter arrived gently over Ashgrove Kingdom, the first peaceful season the castle had experienced in years, without the looming shadow of Draven's ambition or the constant tension of unresolved territorial conflict. Elena found herself settling into a rhythm within the castle that felt increasingly like genuine belonging, rather than the uncertain circumstances that had first brought her through its grand doors. Lord Harwick approached her one morning in the library, his expression carrying unusual warmth, compared to the cautious skepticism he had first shown toward her presence in council meetings months earlier. The king has requested my counsel on on a matter of considerable importance," he said, settling into the chair across from her, with obvious care in choosing his words. "I believe you already understand what that matter concerns." Elena felt her heart quicken with anticipation, though she maintained careful composure. "I am not certain I follow, Lord Harwick." The older advisor's expression softened into something approaching genuine affection. "Miss Whitfield, you arrived at this castle months ago as payment for a debt, viewed by many, myself included, as a temporary complication in matters of kingdom strategy. You have since become something far more significant, not merely to the king, but to this entire kingdom. Your counsel shaped the alliance that secured our borders. Your compassion shaped the peace that resolved conflict without unnecessary bloodshed. Whatever the king intends to ask of you, know that this council, myself included, offers wholehearted support." Elena absorbed his words with quiet emotion, remembering the skepticism and open disapproval that had greeted her earliest presence within these castle walls. The transformation from reluctant outsider to trusted partner felt remarkable when considered against the journey's full scope, though she understood clearly that Damien's steady trust had made that transformation possible. That evening, Damien requested her presence in the throne room, the same grand hall where they had first met months earlier, under circumstances neither could have anticipated leading toward this moment. Elena walked through familiar corridors with her heart racing, sensing the significance of whatever awaited her within that vast chamber. She found him standing before his throne, though he did not sit upon it as he had during their first meeting. Instead, he stood at its base, dressed formally, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely witnessed, even during their most intimate private conversations. "Elena," he said, his voice steady, despite obvious nervousness underlying his careful composure. "Months ago, you walked into this hall believing yourself sold as payment for a debt, expecting cruelty from a king the entire kingdom feared. I gave you my first order that day, declaring that you belonged to no one, that you would remain free within these walls rather than confined as property." Elena remained quiet, allowing him to continue, sensing the significance building steadily within his careful words. "That order changed everything," Damien continued, "not simply for you, but for me as well. I discovered, through your presence within this castle, a version of myself I had believed lost, following my family's death. You taught me that strength and compassion together create far more sustainable outcomes than isolation and fear ever could. You taught me that genuine partnership, built on mutual trust and respect, offers far greater security than rule through distance and control." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and knelt before her, an action Elena had never witnessed from a king known throughout the kingdom for unwavering authority and control. "I am asking you now," he said quietly, "not as an order, not as strategic necessity, but as a request, freely offered and freely able to be refused. Elena Whitfield, will you remain within these walls, not as guest, not as advisor, but as my equal partner, my wife, and the queen this kingdom deserves?" Tears gathered unexpectedly as Elena absorbed the full weight of his request, remembering the frightened, resentful girl who had first walked through these doors, remembering the transformation that had unfolded steadily across months of shared strategy, quiet conversation, and growing trust between them. Whatever fear had first accompanied her arrival at Ashgrove Castle had long since transformed into something she recognized clearly now as genuine belonging, genuine love, and genuine partnership neither had anticipated finding within circumstances that began through such painful necessity. "Yes," she said softly, her voice carrying certainty despite the emotion thick within it. "Yes, Damien, I choose you, freely and completely, not as debt or obligation, but because these months have taught me that genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and trust, offers a life I never dared imagine possible." Damien rose slowly, his expression transforming into genuine joy as he pulled her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than any formal declaration could, of the love and commitment they had built together across months of shared challenge and growing trust. Around them, gathered advisors and household staff who had quietly witnessed the proposal broke into genuine celebration, Bridget's delighted tears mixing with Lord Harwick's dignified but unmistakable approval. The wedding took place as winter gave way to early spring, roses blooming once again throughout the garden courtyard, where Elena and Damien had shared countless quiet conversations across the preceding months. Representatives from the Eastern Alliance attended alongside Ashgrove's own nobility, a testament to the peace and partnership Elena's strategic insight had helped secure for the kingdom's future. Standing before the assembled crowd as Damien's wife, no longer the frightened girl who had arrived believing herself sold like property, Elena reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of her father, who had unknowingly protected her from a far more dangerous fate through his desperate bargain with Ashgrove's treasury. She thought of the ruthless reputation that had preceded Damien, a reputation built on grief and loss rather than genuine cruelty. She thought of the alliance, the negotiated peace, and the countless challenges they had overcome together, throughout their months, building trust and partnership within circumstances neither had chosen, but both had ultimately embraced. The kingdom that had once whispered fearfully of its ruthless alpha king now spoke instead of a ruler transformed by genuine partnership, a king who had learned that true strength included vulnerability, compassion, and the willingness to trust another's counsel as equal, rather than subordinate. Elena Whitfield, once believed sold to a monster, had instead discovered a partner whose first order had changed everything, transforming fear into trust, isolation into partnership, and a debt born from desperate necessity into a love neither had anticipated, but both now treasured completely. As Damien took her hand before the assembled crowd, formally presenting her as Queen of Ashgrove Kingdom, Elena understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges still awaited them in the years ahead, they would face them together, bound not by obligation or debt, but by genuine love, mutual respect, and the remarkable partnership that had grown from such unexpectedly complicated beginnings. The kingdom watched, and for the first time in years, saw not fear reflected in their king's storm-colored eyes, but hope, love, and the quiet, unmistakable joy of a man who had finally, completely, found his way home.